Hello and welcome to Module 6. This is the introduction to Module 6. I'm also going to go through the workshop slides for Objectives 1 and 2. Objectives 1 and 2 are the two objectives that are most applicable to your assignment, your group assignment. Secondly, they are most applicable, they actually directly relate to the activities we are doing in the first part, the first 2/3 of our Zoom workshop on Friday. The other third of our Zoom workshop is being devoted to activities related to your group assignment. You'll notice there are two other objectives, one that deals with the historic and contemporary issues related to the world trading system and one that deals with the costs and benefits of FDI. There are videos supporting that on the Moodle website, as there are also additional videos supporting Objectives 1 and 2. All four objectives could be in the multiple choice quiz for this module. The slides are adapted and developed by me. They're based on Hill and Holt, the International Business Text 12th edition. So what's the objectives for this module? This module, we turn our attention to government policy and international trade. Last week we talked about trade theory. This week we're focusing on government policy and international trade, the practical aspects, I suppose, is the best way to view that. We're going to identify and describe the policy instruments available to governments to influence trade and foreign direct investment. We're going to discuss the case for and the case against intervention, including strategic trade policy. And strategic trade policy is an important contemporary policy. And it links to some things we're going to talk about next week when we talk about regional cooperative arrangements. We're going to discuss, not in this introduction, but in the module as a whole, historic and contemporary issues in the development of the world trading system and its implications for international business and the costs and benefits of FDI and the implications of different FDI policy on international business. You'll notice in your assignment that we do ask some questions about, one of the questions does touch on foreign direct investment policy as well. As I mentioned, there's a pile of resources on the Moodle website for this unit, including a number of explanatory videos. They're presented in an exciting and fun way. I've tried to pick ones that aren't too dry because trade policy, trade theory, trade practice can tend to be a bit heavy, which is why I want to focus very much on the applied aspects. We have a review of key concepts activity, which is based on the interactive lecture and supporting videos, the interactive lecture that I'm doing at the moment, the supporting videos that are on Moodle, and a group activity about what trade and investment policy applies. That activity relates most strongly to Objective 1. And then we've got a theory to practice activity, which looks at the recent Korea-Japan trade war. Now, what I've decided to do is consider COVID at the moment just as an event that will probably pass over the next 12 months, 18 months, though it will have some implications for the future. And as an event, I've decided to keep us looking at 2019, early 2020, the trade frictions between Korea and Japan to give us an idea about how trade policy and practice works. Otherwise, we'll be looking at just one pure overarching issue, which is COVID-19 and its impact. And I don't think that will give you a rich enough experience. So, this week's topic is about the political reality of international trade. Almost all governments talk about having free trade in some form or another. More recently, we've seen some governments, particularly the Trump government, talk more about a protectionist stance, though in reality, when you look at what's actually happening, even though it is the imposition of tariffs and some quite arbitrary behaviours, the rhetoric of what the change is far greater than the reality. Sweeping statements last week, this is a COVID-19 statement by Donald Trump, that America should be able to manufacture 90% of its own pharmaceuticals in America using its own supply chain. Well, nice story. It won't be able to. It won't be able to because it has not, for a long period of time, invested enough in engineering, chemical engineering support, development of supply chains, development of manufacturing, optimization of EPA standards, a range of political, legal, and other ramifications that have meant that the most efficient supply chain is a global supply chain. Secondly, while America likes to believe, or Donald Trump likes to give the impression that they own all the intellectual property related to pharmaceuticals, they don't. They own about 16%. It has declined largely because of the lack of investment in basic science in the US. It has declined, and that lack of investment, I would argue, is because of the Republican Party. But it's declined over that period, over a period of time. But as the world's become globalized, of course, companies are going to use a globalized supply chain. So, I would suggest that we need to have a free trade system to be able to maximize the performance, the economic performance, and the social benefits of trade and investment in a modern society. So most nations, as I said, nominally commit to free trade, but they intervene to protect important groups, interest groups. Modern international trading system is based on the General Agreement of Trades and Tariffs and the World Trade Organization, which is also railed against by Donald Trump and others. In addition to those two, there's a number of other treaties, the TRIPS Agreement on Intellectual Property. There are labour treaties. There are a large number of other treaties that surround the trading system and may have an impact on the trading system. But for today, we're going to focus on GATT and the WTO, or at least GATT and the WTO will be our focus for Objective 3 and 4, and as I said, I've provided you some resources for that. So, Objective 1, identify and describe the policy instruments that are available for governments to influence trade and FDI. So, there are a number of different policy instruments. I'm going to go through briefly each of the instrument areas as a category of instruments, and then once we've done that, as we do that, I'm going to talk about the impact and their role, and try to give you some examples, and the videos that you will see that are in the unit also give you examples. So there are specific tariffs. There are ad valorem tariffs, which are a value-based tariff, which may just broadly apply across the board. There are specific tariffs of things that apply to specific products. For example, there's a specific tariff being applied to ethanol imports into Australia. That will link back to a comment I'll make when we talk about anti-dumping policies, but basically it was set there to protect the Australian ethanol industry from the Brazilian and Argentinian ethanol industry. The Australian ethanol industry is based on sugarcane. The Australian ethanol industry is a very high cost method to produce ethanol. Ethanol is an additive you put in petrol. E10 petrol, for example, you put 10% with your normal petroleum. It reduces the use of oil, the need to import petrol, import gas. Ad valorem tariffs are things that just add value at a price, at a percentage across the board. So it might be that there's a 10% import tariff on all goods, or a broader category of goods that is defined against those. The positive impact of those, so that it increases government revenues, it forces so that's a positive impact. However, despite as you'll see in the media continually, and the reason I'm repeating this is because if you go and look at tariffs on YouTube, as you work through this assignment, you will see Donald Trump saying over and over again that the tariffs he put on Chinese goods are paid for by China, when in reality they are paid for by the consumers of the importing country. So in fact, what happens is, because Donald Trump's policy has put tariffs on Chinese goods, those goods are imported, either the consumer will be paying extra for those goods, or the industry that's using the product or reselling the product will be eating a profitability loss. But you also see the unexpected occurrence of things that fit within the supply chain, like, for example, America used to have one of the largest nails, for building houses and things like that. Nail producers in the world, because they had some technology, older technology, but very efficient remanufacturing of steel, of steel base, to turn it into building products, nails and things, nails and fasteners. Because of the tariffs that have been put on Chinese steel, several of those companies have lost significant amounts of profitability within the supply chain, and two of them have closed. Two of the main ones have closed, or had to closed or restructured into one of the bankruptcy structures in the US. Tariffs are pro-producer, so they're in favour of local producers, because they'll be able to charge more. They actually don't affect foreign producers necessarily, though they may encourage them to become local producers. And we'll talk about that within our discussion of free trade region agreements next week. But they're anti-consumer because they make the consumers pay more for the product. And that consumer can be a industrial consumer, or it can be a retail consumer, just a normal customer like you or me. And therefore, tariffs reduce the overall efficiency of the world economy. The second instrument is subsidies. Now, subsidies are about providing support for an industry. Again, using a contemporary example, when the US put tariffs on Chinese goods, China retaliated in a very strategic way. They put tariffs on soy imports, and they have selected different importers, and they put tariffs on bourbon and a number of and Harley-Davidson motorcycles, or motorcycles in general, from America. They put these tariffs on in a very strategic way to impact on states which are Trump voting states, Republican voting states, but were heavily reliant on those industries. Now, the soy industry and a range of other farming has received massive subsidies, I think about $30 billion, from the Trump administration to support them to export. But that's not the only type of subsidy that could exist. You're trying to provide subsidies to help local producers compete in export markets. So you might be providing tax holidays, you might be providing direct subsidies, you might be providing export grants, a range of subsidies such as that, to support the production of a product. Frequently applied to older industries, frequently applied to agriculture. One of the reasons I said it was frequently applied to older industries was because often the justification for both a tariff and a subsidy is to protect an emerging, a newly growing industry, something you're trying to build up. So Thailand had 85% tariffs on vehicles and vehicle components during the period it was attempting to build up its Board of Investment area on the eastern seaboard of Thailand, which has now become a large vehicle producing area, and they're lowering some of their tariffs, but they've kept the subsidies, the tax holiday subsidies, the infrastructure subsidies, the training subsidies are still in place, so that they can build it up. Now, I said new and old. One of the hardest things to do is remove a subsidy or remove a tariff that protects the domestic industry. So they tend to be quite inefficient in the long-term subsidies because you end up never taking them off successful businesses. Import quotas and voluntary export restraints. Import quotas used to apply to many things around the world. It used to apply to clothing and footwear in Australia. In fact, you had to buy quotas, and there was a trading system where particular, for example, the large department store chain like John Martin's or Myer, David Jones had quota, so that they would then trade and because they had value, because they were the right to import. Those things have gone, but there were import quotas and informal import quotas on Japanese vehicles going into America, which has led to the creation of manufacturing plants in America. There are smart quotas, and one of the things. So I've said a lot of bad things about Donald Trump. I'm now going to say one good thing. In the revision of NAFTA with the new US Mexico-Canada agreement, there are percentage requirements within that region, Canada, Mexico, and America, about production, about quotas of a particular percentage of the components and value of a vehicle. And there's a second set of production and import quotas. So that import quota affects their ability to source from outside of those three countries. So they can't. So they have to manufacture in those three countries a particular percentage of the vehicle, rather than just assemble parts from cheaper production locations in Asia, for example. But the second thing they've done is they've put a requirement related to a proportion of the production needs to be undertaken by workers being paid a particular minimum wage, which has meant that there's been a significant increase in the wages within Mexico. Tariff and quota rates. You get a hybrid quota system with a tariff and a lower tariff applied for the first lot of imports and a higher as later. You get voluntary export restraint. Even though the Japanese vehicles had at stages import quotas, some of those import quotas were actually set as voluntary export constraints, as a government-to-government agreement. So it wouldn't appear that they were being protectionist or break what was then GATT rules, what is now WTO rules, but was a voluntary restraint. And there's also quota rent, the price that you will pay back to the government, like a tax, to own a quota. Export bans. We see technology being banned to being exported to countries, particular countries. Toshiba got in trouble, even though Toshiba is a Japanese company, because it was exporting particular technology to countries because Toshiba is a Microsoft laptops, and they had things in their laptops that couldn't be exported to particular countries, and so they had an export tariff or a complete export ban. That was to ensure that there was so the export ban was for political reasons or couched as anti-terrorism reasons. The PlayStation 4 could not be exported to particular countries in the Middle East, and so on. So export bans is to entirely or partly restrict the export of a good. The US has bans currently on the amount of helium that can be exported. In the lead up to the COVID crisis, China placed restrictions on exports on some of the products that they realised would be crucial for their response to COVID-19, which seems to be an entirely legitimate thing to do to me. US had a ban on export of crude oil for a period of time in the late 70s. And there are also, in Australia, for example, there's an export tariff which was linked to a supply requirement for natural gas, that a particular proportion of natural gas has to be provided to particular markets. Now, interestingly, that export tariff applies in particular agreements, and that export ban limitation. It doesn't apply to the supply of natural gas by Santos it does apply to the supply of natural gas by Santos to Australia, to South Australia, and there's also some other reasons for that related to ownership of Santos and the way ownership was set up, and some tax subsidies that Santos received for keeping its head office in South Australia. Santos used to be called South Australian and Northern Territory oil, something. I don't know what the S stands for. However, the same things for the Santos gas that's being developed in Queensland does not apply to the supply to New South Wales. It's purely contractual at a market rate. Similarly, the Northwest gas it doesn't apply to. So it can be applied to different regions in a country, but it's designed to keep particular things in a country that they will need. Now, one of the sort of race-based or race-baiting things that the far right in Australia talks about is how we won't be, we need to be food secure, so we need to not let our farms be owned by overseas companies, particularly Chinese companies they rail against, and also reduce our exports because we will have food insecurity. Well, our food supply chain is enough to service around 200 million people, and Australia's got 25 million people in it. So that's purely a race-based political statement. Local content requirements for there to be a particular proportion manufactured within a country or within a region. The example I gave about the US treaty issues between US, Mexico and Canada related to vehicle manufacturing was one of those things. Also, the requirements can be on physical terms or value-based terms. It's there to protect producers and consumers face higher prices. The debate at the moment about whether to force streaming services to meet Australian local content rules, partly because all the networks in Australia have either gone into bankruptcy and emerged, or have all the free-to-air television networks, or are close, as Channel 7 is at the moment, will have significant financial issues. In the case of Channel 7, that's being enhanced by the fact it was so sport-dependent for its ratings. So all those content, there's a local content requirement that 30% of the content needs to be produced in Australia and New Zealand, because a subsequent agreement means that New Zealand production is part of Australia for local content purposes. But streaming services like Disney Plus and Netflix, and indeed Stan, do not have to do that. Now, Stan's owned by Channel 9 and Channel and Fairfax. They used to be two companies, now they're one, so it's owned by 9. Stan, as a streaming service, has made a big thing about local content in the last little while. They've launched 3 or 4 local content productions, only 10 episodes of each of them, in late December, early January. They also have several New Zealand local content series that are contemporary series on theirs. They're using that to justify the fact that we're already doing this. Why aren't Netflix and Disney Plus and others? So they're using that actually as a lever to get to protect the 9 network as well. Similarly, we've got a pile of, there may be restrictions being placed on Google and Facebook, as Spain and France has done, related to paying for content and ensuring there's enough local content, and ensuring as well that content is attributed. A little bit different to local content requirements. And there's also administrative policies that look at things that limit the choice of consumers. So protecting access or increasing access through the way you deal with a policy instrument. Now, that policy instrument can be implemented through a tax, tariff, for subsidy, or some other restriction, but it is a content requirement, and by some other restriction, it can be just defined as it is with local content in Australia for broadcast media. Anti-dumping policies. The objective is to protect domestic producers from unfair competition, and domestic producers can sign a petition with the Commerce Department in the US or in Australia. They do it through the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and this what was formerly Austrade. They deal with and often through the World Trade Organization. They deal with they can place tariffs or other restrictions to prevent dumping. Dumping is when a product is being overproduced and then sold at too cheap a price. One of the things that used to happen in Europe, though less so now, is because of the way that subsidies worked for farm production, you had a glut of particular farm production, particularly tomatoes and butter, that would then mean that those things could, there was an oversupply of those areas and they would be exported at less than cost and dumped on other markets. But there are other things we've seen. There's been claims that China dumps steel in the US. There's a whole range of dumping when you're selling things that are too low, in sometimes to try to put out the other industry. One of the claims at the moment is one of the reasons that Saudi Arabia and others didn't drop their production of oil during the first 6 or 8 weeks of the COVID crisis was because because traditional oil drilling has a particular cost base. Fracking, which is where you go and drill into shale oil, which is what majority of US oil drilling is, has a far higher cost base. So there was a belief that the belief was touted that one of the things that was happening was that they were keeping the prices of oil artificially low to put the American producers out of business. Now, America has a policy that they will be energy self-sufficient, and the Obama administration created oil self-sufficiency and energy self-sufficiency for the US during their period of operations. And that was achieved, I think, in 2014, so halfway through Obama's second term, which is significantly earlier than the period that Donald Trump currently claims that he has achieved that. So that's our list of policies. The review activity that you should prepare is for the countries you used in your first assignment. Prepare answers for these questions, and then we're going to have a group discussion on it. Those answers for these questions will also help you when you have to go and look at the contextual issues and market entry issues we're asking in your second assignment. Note as well that this could be in the quiz as well. It's just because it's in the assignment doesn't mean it's not in the quiz. Just because I'm spending the time on objectives 1 and objectives 2 doesn't mean they're not in the quiz. So, objective 2, what's the case for and against intervention? You notice that last slide was in pink. That's because it's the online stuff. You see stuff online on the website. Stuff for online and preparing for Zoom is in pink as well. Just to mention too that I've made the Zoom workshop group activity, and I've asked you to do some things related to your group assignment. Right, second thing, discuss the case for, second objective, discuss the case for and against intervention in international trade and investment, including strategic trade policy. So let's look at strategic trade policy. Strategic trade policy is our end point of this discussion because there's a number of different ways that you can lead yourself to having cases for and against intervention, right? And strategic trade policy, we mentioned a format of that last week. We're going to talk about that more next week. But we're seeing strategic trade policy in the case that we're going to do, which is based on the video of the Korean trade war, which is our other activity for the Zoom workshop. Note as well that there are videos to support this discussion, not only of intervention, not only of what I've already talked about instruments, but also the objective 3 and 4. I want to keep emphasizing that because of the unique way we're presenting in this year. There are political in this year, in this semester, in this trimester. I Should have had an extra coffee before I started this. Let me have a sip of Coca-Cola so that I can get my head or my voice back. So, what are the political arguments for trade intervention? Protecting jobs is the most common argument, most common political reason for government intervention. Even if that is not true, industry and government frequently argue that that is the rationale. We are keeping in the US they're keeping the argument for reopening, the argument for keeping open meat plants is being mounted because it's about protecting jobs and protecting industries. And they're emphasising the protecting jobs because people really want to go back to work. When it's really about protecting particular companies, and those companies have high lobbying power. But protecting jobs and protecting industries is a key argument for intervention. And it can be made as a real argument, and it can also be made as a purely political argument that is designed just to support other interest groups. Generally, unfair competition claims are made as well, that what's happening in the overseas market is unfair, that America is losing jobs in manufacturing because of the cheap labour, when really America is really losing in jobs in manufacturing is because of robotics. Australia is losing jobs in dirty manufacturing, gaining jobs in clean manufacturing. So I would argue that there's not a strong argument that unfair competition from overseas companies impacts on jobs and industries. That being said, it is a clearly and frequently made political argument. By lobby groups, by industry, by unions, by social commentators, all of whom influence the political process. The second thing is about protecting national security, and protecting national security can be extended as far as you want to go. While Donald Trump is mounting the argument about that I mentioned earlier about pharmaceutical manufacturing in Australia in the beginning of the week, he was mounting that argument saying, it's because we're going to protect our national security because we need to be able to manufacture pharmaceuticals in America to protect our national security. We can't be reliant on other countries. It's a national security issue. This week he also, and therefore it's crucial to our defence, this week he moved also to today, US time. Yesterday US time, today our time. He also made an argument that this will create hundreds of millions of jobs, hundreds of thousands of jobs, he actually said. But I'm sure the way he exaggerates, by the end of the week, it'll be hundreds of millions. So protecting industry, protecting national security, protecting self-sufficiency. The same argument used to be mounted in Australia about the car industry. The same argument is mounted about ownership of agricultural land by foreign companies, and which seems to me pretty strange because what are they going to do? Take the land overseas with them? But still. So, it's also used to retaliate. Government use threats of intervention as a bargaining tool to open markets. This has gone back all the way to the blockade of Japan in the 1800s by the US military. It goes on further. It's threats that go back and forth in the negotiation between China and the US, between the US, Canada and Mexico, about free trade agreements and trade liberalisation. It may liberalise trade and result in economic gains, but it's a pretty risky strategy, and frequently there is collateral damage, and the side effects of that collateral damage often outweigh the benefits in real terms. And also, these political interventions are easily got around. America has placed tariffs on China. on particular products that are manufactured in China. China has therefore just invested in Vietnam and Africa and Turkey, and I can name a pile of other places, to do that manufacturing. It actually suits China because they've moved up the value chain in their production. It creates a stronger political link between China and those countries, but also it means that the products that are being exported from Vietnam that used to be exported from China still make profit for the Chinese companies, still get exported to America, so there's no real change in what's going into America, just the source of where it's coming from. And the flip is, with less flexible areas, and this has happened, China has Harley Davidson, an American icon company, because of the tariffs, has established manufacturing now in Asia and Europe that it didn't used to have because of the retaliatory restrictions that both China and the EU placed because of America's behaviour related to particularly steel tariffs. Tesla's announcement that there will be Tesla manufacturing on all continents in the world within 6 years is driven by avoiding the ability to have those political issues. And in fact, I'm not sure how he's going to manufacture in the Antarctic, but I'm sure he'll find a way. So maybe it's just the other continents. But there's already exploratory teams in Adelaide looking at setting up a gigafactory in Adelaide, not only for Tesla, but for others. They've got their Texas site, their China site has opened. They are intending to open a site in Europe and possibly 2 sites in Africa. So, because Africa is the next low-cost labour, high robotics site, and it's also closer to some of the suppliers of the rare earth materials and other resources. So retaliation might not work or might have unintended consequences. So it's risky. Protecting consumers from unsafe products. That's frequently used legitimately to set standards. It's also used in a strange way because America has its own approval system, own standard system. Every country has its own standard system, but America has its own approval system, its own standard system that is unique and different. Many countries have their own standard systems, but agree to take things that meet a general standard. If we take, for example, N95 masks, everyone's talking about N95 masks. N95 mask means that the NOISH in the US has approved those masks. And in fact, there were 2 sets of approval. One is the NOIS approval, which is N95 means it filters 95% of a particular type of particulate matter. R95 includes oil, so it's still 95%. There were medical N95 masks that had to also be approved by the FDA or the NIH, I can't remember which. And there was also non-medical masks which are used in industry, because all over industry, N95 masks are used, as are other masks related to construction issues. Well, N95 masks in the US, the industrial ones, could not be used in hospitals. So they changed the law during the COVID-19 issue. But KN95, which are N95 masks manufactured in the Asian standard and predominantly in China, but that's the KN95 standard is the Asian standard. The Pan-Asian standard, which Australia also accepts, and they can now be exported to America, but technically they can't be used in hospitals, though, of course, with the shortage they are being. They're exactly the same mask, they just have a different approval. The UK has a P system, a system that begins with P, and their masks are 94%. So the most common mask is the P2s. There's P1, P2, P3. P1 is the basic mask that has particulate matter, so you use it in industry, has far higher protection than a surgical mask. P2 is the same as the N95 mask effectively, except it's 94%, so therefore can't be used in America. And then the P3 is the same as the N99 or the R99, which is 99%. Why am I saying all these things? Most of the European standards are accepted everywhere globally except America. If you meet that standard, you've met that standard. Australia uses KN95 masks, and it uses the British system as well, the European system as well. Just by the way, PM 2.5 is about particulate matter. That's 2.5 micrograms, I think, which is about, the pollution dust that you see in bushfires, in just the air generally. That doesn't help you with COVID. Does help you to an extent with bushfires. But the masks that were being issued to rural areas, and for people like me who are allergic to particulate matter based on bushfire smoke, though I can handle other particulate matter quite easily, were the P2 masks. But many people use PM 2.5 masks just for general pollution, and a lot of those cycling masks meet that standard, but they're not for viral, they're just for dust, and they're a different type of mask. So all these standards exist, and some of them are required, and they're all about limiting products. Now, I said they can all be used legitimately. There's a consequence that's illegitimate. It's in fact protecting local manufacturing for the US, while not for the rest of the world. But there's also some, and Australia has used this, I would suggest at times, using quarantine restrictions for product standards to prevent or limit imports of particular products. So those restrictions can be used legitimately or not legitimately. There are also issues related to policy objectives. You might want to grant preferential trade terms to particular countries. You might want to, as the US want to do, offer preferential trade treatment, but limit the period. So it has to be renewed each year because it enables you to do to put political pressure on countries you're negotiating with. Other countries do that as well, but the US does it most prominently, partly because of the dysfunction that exists in the Congress. Where the Congress controls that, not the President. The President can renew it, the Congress has to authorise it for a longer period. Trade policy can be used also to punish rogue states, to ban imports, to put restrictions on exports, as was happening in Iran. And when we lived in Dubai, for example, one of the clearly strange things is if you're from America, you weren't allowed to travel Iraq. You weren't allowed to travel to Iran. I'm right. Yes, I meant to say Iran. You weren't allowed to travel to Iran. None of the hotel chains that had operated in the ski fields in Iran, which were linked to Hilton and Hyatt, and those could continue operating. But every other nationality could. You used to get people that were teachers and academics and professionals that were working in hubs in Dubai and Abu Dhabi, flying to the cheap ski fields in Iran for the weekend, and they would stay in, and this was in the early 2000s, they would stay in former 5-star hotels that hadn't been really updated since the revolution, but still have the normal type of fabulous skiing. I know that's a trivial example, but I think it's a nice example. The restriction placed on Iran currently related to oil, related to banking, related to... they're not consistently applied. The US is following a different path to Europe and Australia, for example. Finally, you can have it for protecting human rights. The apartheid restrictions that were placed on South Africa to put pressure on the government to remove apartheid. The current restrictions that are placed on Zimbabwe. Smart sanctions that are being placed when you actually are targeting particular people so you don't damage the population. For example, if you're from Fiji, which was led by a revolutionary government with limited democracy, there are people in Fiji in the military and the government whose family and children cannot come and study, cannot get visas to come to Australia and other countries, cannot invest and move. This is placing smart tariffs on those people, but we can go over and go for a holiday. And many other trading relationships, they're just smart restrictions aimed at putting pressure on the government to change human rights issues. And finally, there's the infant industry example. And in infant industry, what we're talking about in infant industries is that you're supporting through tariffs and quotas and subsidies emerging industries. So you're trying to encourage the development of biotechnology industries or car manufacturing, or as we're doing at the moment, electric vehicle manufacturing, or as a whole range of areas that you're trying to encourage the development of a new industry by protecting them. Protecting of manufacturing from foreign competition no good unless the protection helps make the industry more efficient. And it assumes that the firms are unable to make efficient long-term investments by borrowing money from domestic or international capital markets. That second statement is very prominent in your textbook. The reason that second statement is very prominent in your textbook comes down to what is a continuous argument by the US that other countries support industries that put America at a disadvantage. So the creation of Airbus and the support of Airbus, which is an example of strategic industry policy across Europe, to have this competitive environment, so there would be a competitor to Boeing and McDonnell Douglas, which is owned by Boeing now, in Europe, through the merger and consolidation of government-owned and private-owned aircraft manufacturing firms in Europe to form Airbus. And because they're government-owned, they're able to access low-cost loans, and they have other supporting structures, is seen as something that's an anathema to the free market of the US aircraft industry. And that can be applied across a lot of things. Now, one thing that makes it such an interesting argument is if you look at the way the US invests in military technology, that the amount of subsidy that may be going from military investment, which doesn't seem to be very well cost controlled, into the same industries, into the R&D in the same industries, may in fact outweigh the amount that the European Union and UK, because they're also part of Airbus, provide to the production of Airbus, the support of Airbus. So those are the criticisms both ways. It would appear that support has made Airbus very efficient. Thailand would not have had an auto manufacturing industry and a rapidly economically developing eastern seaboard without those type of border of investment without that type of border of investment support. China would not have grown as quickly without its investment in transportation infrastructure and its support through low-cost loans and through state-owned enterprises in partnership of the growth of manufacturing. Which leads us to strategic trade policy. Now, I said the last one was the last one. This is the last one. Governments can do all of the things that I've just mentioned in an ad hoc way. If governments are trying to do it in a strategic way to gain the same type of first mover advantages that companies and countries have gained in the past just through natural economic development, They can intervene in industry by helping a domestic firm overcome barriers to entry created by foreign firms that have already reaped first mover advantage, or they can develop their own national income through first mover advantage. Both of these involve government intervention in a strategic way to support those activities. Now, those things I've mentioned up to here are the cases for intervention. And I've talked in places through there on the benefits and the shortcomings of the cases for intervention. Here's the issues that arise. The case against this comes from Krugman. Strategic trade policies aimed at establishing domestic firms in a dominant position boost national income at the expense of other countries. These policies, however, may provoke retaliation, and the ability for you to use this strategic trade policy may result in retaliation of tariffs, of anti-dumping policies, and other actions by other countries that minimise the success of your country's strategic trade policy, but also further distort the trading relationships. Now, the other case that we need to think about when we're talking about strategic trade policy, and when we're thinking about all of the actions that have been taken before, is that governments don't always act in the national interest, that interest groups may influence policy, and as Krugman notes, that strategic policy is almost certain to be captured by special interest groups that distort it for their own ends. So you get ethanol manufacturers indicating that we're going to have this strategic market in Australia based on our climate, based on the fact that we're a large sugarcane producer and this offsets, sugar's changing, this value added of producing ethanol will give us a global market, but you've got to protect us against the lower cost producers already because they're producing in South America much cheaper, so protect us. And then ultimately, have we seen a large export industry of ethanol arise? No. But we've seen that company protected. And the same thing can apply across the board. So, what I want you to do, now that I've gone through the political and economic arguments for intervention, the political arguments and the economic arguments for intervention, I've got a video called on the Japan-Korea trade war. I want you to look at that video and look at the political and economic arguments, and that might require that if you want to do a bit of extra work, come to class ready to discuss it in your groups. Okay, so that's the introduction and objective 1 and 2. As I mentioned, objective 3 and 4, which deal with the historical contemporary issues in the development of the world trading system and its international business implications, and also the cost and benefit of FDI and its implications. The slides are there on the Moodle website, and there are supporting videos that talk about those things, and those things can in fact be assessed. We'll mention those things a little bit in the Zoom workshop on Friday as well. Okay, see you at the drop-in sessions. See you Friday.